Hey friend, in this tutorial we are wrapping up our 5-week series on a series that we've been building technique upon technique upon technique. We're finishing it up today with the application. So we're gonna be doing a wintry, snowy tree landscape to tie it all together. This is basically how I break down my book, Everyday Watercolor. And also with the launch of my Everyday Watercolor Companion Course this upcoming month, January 2024, I wanted to just give you guys a little sneak peek or a preview of the teaching style and some of the methods and how I break things down inside my book and also the companion course. We'll link to both of those below if you want to check them out. Again, the companion course comes out next month, but in this tutorial, I'm going to be covering a landscape that again builds on the previous weeks in this series. So let's dive in. So I am first going to be washing a thin glaze of just clean water with my Mottler brush. This is an 1.5 inch Mottler brush from Princeton Aqua Elite series. One of my favorite and go-to brushes for landscapes. We'll link to the brush in the description of this video. And then I'm just grabbing another bigger brush, but this is the size 12 filbert brush. You don't need to use a filbert, you can use a wash brush, but something around this size. This is a size 12, and I'm just striping in this really thick and creamy consistency of Prussian blue. You can also use a round brush for this, something a little bit bigger size. And because the water that's covering the entire sheet of paper is still really wet, all this color is going to blend very aggressively up and do those fun blooms. So I'm using wet and wet technique, which we've covered previously in this series. This is the 5th part of the 5-part series that we've been doing every Saturday the past 5 weeks. And so if you are newer to this series, then we'll make sure to link to those earlier videos so that you can check them out. Now I'm adding in some more blackish blue color, so Prussian blue and a little bit of black, and also using the thin part of my brush to kind of streak in these thin lines for trunks, and a couple blurry evergreen or pine tree vibe strokes back and forth. These are all going to be covered up and layered on top of using wet on dry technique, so I'm not too worried about making too many shapes. It's all going to be covered up with darker, thicker colors. So we're just laying down our base color. This is going to help build depth and volume with our trees. It's going to make it feel like a really dense forest because of all the foggy, kind of blurry background trees shapes that we're painting in here. I'm just kind of smoothing out some of my colors before everything dries, and then I'll go in with my next layer once this dries to paint in some trees. Painting in some more zigzaggy tree shapes. Something that I cover a lot inside the Everyday Watercolor Companion Course is how to build depth and volume in your landscapes like this. And one of my favorite chapters in my book, Everyday Watercolor, is of a misty jungle scene. And I love painting misty, foggy tree scenes like jungles or a misty evergreen forest like this one. This one's gonna have some snowfall in it. But I highly recommend, if you liked this series that we did here on YouTube and you just like my teaching style, I highly recommend checking out the Everyday Watercolor Companion Course. As it's my most condensed and most in-depth cover of the main techniques of watercolor and building stage by stage like my book Everyday Watercolor does, and using examples from all 3 of my books, Everyday Watercolor Flowers, and Everyday Watercolor Seashores. So I am tilting my paper up right now because I want everything to streak and point upwards, just like how the trees do in a forest. So that's just a really simple, easy trick that you can do if you're painting these type of trees to make it look like it's pointing upwards. And I'm using a size 16 round brush from Princeton Heritage series, 40/50 series, to just lightly sprinkle in some of these more spotty tree shapes. I'm just zigging and zagging back and forth and not overdoing this at this stage because I want this to feel really sparse and wispy, like it's being covered by mist. And using Prussian blue and a little bit of black in a thicker consistency than our base layer of colors. And I'm just doing these little spotty trees here and there, scattering them around the background. I'm not covering everything with these trees, but because the base layer is still wet, it's getting that fuzzy circular shape, which helps to bring in more of a concrete shape for the trees, but also still kind of blurry. Maybe a couple more of these trees scattered around. So I'm just increasing the accuracy of the shapes with every layer. So our first layer is very, very blurry, also much lighter and more transparent. Second layer, the shapes are a little bit more concrete or definable and less blurry. And the colors are a little bit thicker, so they're laying on top. Still using only wet and wet technique, no wet on dry yet. But as my base layer is drying, I'm able to get these more precise or defined shapes because the base layer isn't as wet. And I love how moody these blues look together, especially in the really dark areas. How some of this blue is still standing out on top of those really dark areas, and it makes it feel really, really moody and mysterious. So in the lighter areas, I'm just lightening my color just a little bit more than the trees that I painted in the darker blue areas, just to keep the tones and the hues pretty similar, just a few shades darker than whatever is underneath. And don't worry if you're starting to see any cauliflowers or hard lines at this stage. Most of it is going to be covered up once we start adding our trees in the foreground using wet on dry technique. So some of these cauliflowers that you see down here are because the base layer was mostly dry, and so the water isn't able to spread evenly and as far as it normally would, and so it's pushing up against drier pigment and creating those hard lines. But also for a snowy scene, the cauliflowers and hard lines are kind of working. It makes it kind of feel frosty. So now we're at the stage where everything is dry underneath. All my trees are dry, and I'm able to go back on top of my layers that I have so far with a thicker, really thick dark blue. So I'm using Prussian blue and black still. But this consistency is really dry and buttery. So it's got some dry brush texture, which is really nice for the shapes of these trees. So you get some natural texture. I'm just using my round brush and starting with a smudge in the middle on the trunk and then wisping it out to the sides, kind of like creating a mustache shape with each one of these sections. And I'm using the brush in all kinds of angles, some on its side like I'm chiseling, or coming from beneath the shape that I'm painting, or on top of the shape that I'm painting, or just above. The angle of your brush and getting used to all the different shapes and strokes that you can create from different holds and slants and angles is really a fascinating thing to watch and study. And this is something that I break down in detail inside of my Everyday Watercolor Companion Course, is talking about the different brush holds, like slanted hold versus vertical hold, and when you use certain types of holds for certain techniques and paintings. So if you're really struggling with making a brush work right for you, or it's not getting the right shapes or what you see in a tutorial you're following, then it's definitely worth the investment. And it is under $100, so a very good price. So I'm still just working on this first tree that's in the foreground, and I want to really make this, the detail in this, specifically this tree, stand out and be more crisp and defined since it's the first tree in the front. And I want to start leading people's eyes through the forest starting at this point. Now I'm working on my next tree. The trunk can be a little bit lighter and more transparent, and we're going to start building our trees that are just in between the background and this tree that's in the foreground. So building in a few more trees scattered throughout the foreground and background, using more transparent layers to make them feel further away. And just smushing my brush around, creating these little mustache shapes on the trees, and making sure to taper and get smaller towards the top, fatter towards the bottom. Now starting to paint some more here in the middle. It's really the same repeated steps now at this point, because we're painting the same trees in just different values and transparencies. So if you want it to look more and more dense and detailed, then make sure you put in a lot of these lighter value trees layered on top using wet on dry, because that's just gonna make the piece feel way more dense with trees. And you could literally do these trees for days. And so these trees right here that I'm painting here in the middle, in this lighter value or consistency, are going to be painted on top of with darker trees to make them look further away and creating that density in the forest. So going back in with my size 6 brush now, and I have my dark blackish blue color, and I'm gonna create a few more needly shapes using the tip of my brush on some of these little mustaches and accentuating, making sure that trunk is really standing out with my darkest color, and just adding some accents of this really dark, thick black. Just a little bit of blue in this mixture. This is so that it stands out on top of the really dark blue that's already underneath. It's a time-consuming step, painting in some of these needles and thinner strokes, but it's an easy brush stroke to do. I'm just flicking in a downward motion and pulling the brush towards me, not away from me, to get those really thin strokes. And I'm using a very vertical straight up and down hold with the brush to get those thin strokes. But the more of this that you add, the more detailed the piece will feel. And it just, sometimes all you need is a little bit of patience to get you through some of those middle stages where things don't really look that awesome. And then you keep adding the detail, keep adding the layers and layers on top of whatever you have going on. And then the piece starts to take a turn and look awesome. So still continuing through now that all my base layer trees are dry with this really thin, darkest blue consistency and thickest consistency that I have so far. So mostly black with a little bit of blue, and I'm just striping in these floaty tree shapes around our trunks using the tip of the brush and not the belly of the brush to make sure that it stays really thin and wispy. And just scattering these around in different heights. Make sure your heights are all at kind of random staggered heights. And following the shape of your background color fog that you painted in the first steps. Now it's starting to really come together. Something super fun that I like to add is just a splattering of white gouache, or you can use a toothbrush, you can use ink, you can use something white like a chalk pen or a gel marker or something like that. And I'm just going to use my size 6 round brush and flick the ferrule of the brush to splatter some snowflakes. It'll especially pop over those really dark trees, so get it really good in that area. And the more you tap, the smaller the dots become. So make sure you tap a lot so you get a variety of different sizes of these little dots. So fun. So wintry, very Pacific Northwest winter vibe. Very peaceful thing to paint. And goes along really well with everything I cover inside Everyday Watercolor and Everyday Watercolor Companion Course. And just a great fun painting to practice these techniques a lot more. There you have it. I hope you loved this 5-week series. Again, make sure you come back to these videos at any time. Yes, they are wintry, but you can learn so much from these videos, and building the technique on the previous week with a new technique is such a great way to learn, with just gradually turning the heat up on your skill level. And also, I hope you check out my book, Everyday Watercolor, along with my Everyday Watercolor Companion Course. It's something I'm very excited about in order to help you guys really dive deep into the skill of watercolor and developing those skills over a course of 30 days or longer if you take longer, and breaking them down by each daily exercise that you should be focusing on. So I hope you check those both out. We'll be linking them in the description of this video. And as always, thank you for watching these videos. I will see you in the new year. Happy New Year and happy holidays.